Hi, I'm Oscar Jurkenrup. I'm from the University of Birmingham in the UK. I'm a professor of exercise metabolism, and I've worked several years with elite athletes in a variety of sports. I'm particularly interested in triathlon, and that's the topic of this talk, nutrition for triathlon. When we talk about triathlon, we're not talking about one sport. It's actually a whole variety of sport with different nutritional requirements. We talk about events as short as 25 minutes or 20 minutes, up to Ironman distance, which takes 8 hours for the fastest athletes, and can take up to 16 hours for some of the other athletes. Because the nutritional requirements are so different in this talk, I'm just going to focus on Ironman nutrition. And these are some of the key issues in Ironman nutrition, and I've divided them into training and to racing. For training, it is important to have an adequate carbohydrate intake to avoid overreaching and overtraining, but I will not go into that. I will go into some of the strategies that we have for racing. First of all, starting adequately fueled and hydrated, avoiding running out of energy during the race, avoiding dehydration, avoiding hyponatremia. A very important one is avoiding GI distress during the race and avoiding muscle cramps. First of all, energy expenditure can be extremely high during an Ironman. And there are reports of 8,000 to 11,000 calories. In one athlete, this was measured with doubly labeled water, 9.3 thousand calories during the Ironman triathlon. That is an enormous amount of energy, especially if you realize that the intake is probably limited to about 400 kilocalories per hour. We cannot take much more energy on board than that. And that means that with any Ironman, we end up with a very large negative energy balance. And we can combat that somewhat by feeding carbohydrate during exercise. And we've done a series of studies where we look at the oxidation of ingested carbohydrate. And this is an example of one of these studies where we compare two different carbohydrates. The upper line here is glucose oxidation during 2 hours of exercise. And you can see that first there's an increase over the first 60 minutes, and then it levels off at a value, in this case, of 0.8 grams per minute. If we use a different carbohydrate, galactose, then the oxidation rates are much lower, meaning that galactose is probably less effective. What I'm particularly interested in is the peak oxidation rates towards the end of exercise. And interestingly, that if we give a single type of carbohydrate, these peak oxidation rates never go over 1 gram per minute. In this case, it's 0.8 grams per minute, but the limit really seems to be 1 gram per minute, independent of the amount of carbohydrate you feed to people. And we investigated why that would be, and the main reason is probably because intestinal absorption becomes limiting. So in this slide, these gray bars represent different amounts of carbohydrate and different types of carbohydrate that were ingested, and the more colorful bars represent how much of that carbohydrate was actually utilized. The first 3 bars here are studies that is a study that I've already shown you, where glucose, if you increase the amount of glucose ingested, you don't increase the oxidation rate. But if you give a mixture of glucose and fructose and use different intestinal transporters, you can get an increased oxidation rate. If we use glucose and sucrose, very similar results. Or in this next study, maltodextrins and fructose, we find very high oxidation rates of 1.5 grams per minute. We then increased the ingestion rate even more to 2.4 grams per minute and gave glucose and sucrose. Oxidation rates didn't really go up. And then when we gave a mixture of glucose, fructose, and sucrose, oxidation rates were very high, 1.7 grams per minute. And the best results so far we found with a mixture of glucose and fructose, 1.75 grams per minute. So a few years ago, we thought that 1 gram per minute was the absolute maximum, the red line in this graph. But now we know that we can actually go much higher. up to 1.7, 1.75 grams per minute. And this may be especially interesting for exercise in hot conditions, where normally the use of ingested carbohydrate is limited, probably because of a reduced blood flow to the gut. But when we give glucose and fructose mixtures, we can increase the exogenous carbohydrate oxidation by 36%, meaning that these glucose fructose mixtures may be especially effective in hot conditions. Only recently, we actually looked at the effects on performance. And in this study, we had 3 different trials, a placebo, a glucose, and a glucose-fructose trials. We asked athletes to cycle for 2 hours at 60%, followed by a time trial of about 40 kilometers. And this graph shows the power output during that time trial. So the longer the bars, the better the performance. And you can see these are the times: 67 minutes to complete the 40 kilometers with placebo, 60.41 minutes to complete it with glucose, and only 56 minutes to complete it with glucose and fructose. And that means there's a 9% improvement in performance if we ingest carbohydrate, glucose, versus placebo. But on top of that, there's another 8% improvement if we give a mixture of glucose and fructose. Another issue for Ironman triathletes and endurance athletes in general is GI discomfort. And a lot of endurance athletes report various problems. And these problems have been related to things like fiber intake, protein intake, fat intake, but also the use of highly concentrated carbohydrate solutions. Now, based on the previous slide, I would recommend an intake of approximately 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And that's a very high intake. That is 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour from a carbohydrate mixture. I would never do this with a single type of carbohydrate because it wouldn't be utilized. But what we found is that this glucose and fructose mixture is relatively well tolerated, probably because it has a greater oxidation efficiency, meaning that more of the ingested carbohydrate is actually utilized and probably less of that carbohydrate is sitting in the intestine. Another issue could be hyponatremia. And symptomatic hyponatremia has been reported in a number of people that reported to the medical tent after the Ironman Hawaii and other Ironman events. The exact incidence is not really known, and depending on which papers you read, you find a lower or a higher incidence, but it definitely does occur. Some people will report these symptoms having gained weight, which is something that could be easily prevented by not drinking too much. But some of these athletes lose weight, and there the diagnosis and the treatment may be a little bit more complicated. Electrolyte losses could be a problem because some athletes have very high sweat rates, up to or over 2 liters per hour, and that sweat contains electrolytes, so you could actually lose fairly large amounts of salt. Total sweat losses can be over 10 liters, and there have been reports of water turnovers of 16.6 liters during one race. And if you take into account typical electrolyte losses, actually the total salt loss over the course of an Ironman triathlon can be considerable. So if you're a very salty sweater, then you should really consider salt supplementation. If I put all of this into a practical advice and what your carbohydrate choice should be, and in this case, in this slide, I have actually put different triathlon events on here. If we are talking about a super sprint or a really short, high-intensity event, there's probably no need to take carbohydrate on board. If the event is a little bit longer, we talk about sprint distance triathlon, which is a very popular sport, then you could actually probably just have a mouth rinse with a carbohydrate solution. You don't even have to swallow that carbohydrate because we've shown that even a simple mouth rinse can improve performance. Olympic distance triathlon, that is where the carbohydrate has to be ingested to be used as a fuel, but you could probably do with up to 30 grams per hour. And then when we go to the longer distance events, half Ironman, Ironman 70.3, or even Ironman, we go up into the 60 grams per hour or even 90 grams per hour range, where if you use 90 grams per hour, they have to be multiple transportable carbohydrates, otherwise they will not all be oxidized. So if I wrap this up in a number of conclusions for training, and I didn't discuss this, but carbohydrate intake should be 7 to 10 grams per kilogram per day, depending on how much you're actually training, what part of the training phase you're in. For racing, minimize fluid losses, but do not overdrink. Choose drinks and gels high in sodium, or especially if you're a salty sweater, consider taking salt tablets, but in moderation, because excess salt intake can also cause cramping. Ingest 60 to 70 grams of carbohydrate per hour. If you're using a single carbohydrate, you can increase that up to 90 grams per hour if you use multiple transportable carbohydrates. And the advantage of doing that, of using a glucose and fructose mixture, is that that results in increased oxidation of the drink, increased oxidation efficiency. It also enhances the fluid availability. It works especially in hot conditions. It also seems to reduce fatigue, and we now have evidence that it improves performance, especially during very prolonged exercise. And that is my last slide, a very short summary of nutrition in Ironman triathlon. Thank you very much.